Hey guys, I just wanted to give you a quick message before you listen to this episode. On this podcast, I'm always trying to give you guys, the audience, a lot of food for thought, questioning things that kind of don't really get the attention and credit they deserve in terms of news coverage or journalistic integrity. So I just wanted to say that this episode is something I've worked on for a while. I actually went over to Amsterdam myself to kind of converse and try and get the interview, and I'm so proud of it and I'm so happy you're listening to it. I would love to know your thoughts and your opinions via the social media apps linked to Sexonomic. And if you are in Amsterdam and have any questions, please pop in to the Prostitution Information Centre where Phoebe is based. I'm so excited for you guys to listen to this episode, and I definitely want to know your thoughts, as I said. So, without further ado, I hope you enjoy learning a little bit more about the Red Light District and its history and the politics around it. And I hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to Sexonomics, Phoebe. This is a podcast where we discuss everything going on within the sexual economy. If you would like to tell the audience a little bit about yourself and what you do with the work with the PIC in Amsterdam.
Hi, my name's Phoebe. I'm the coordinator of the Prostitution Information Centre, which is an information centre in the heart of the Red Light District in Amsterdam, and we provide information about sex work to anyone who walks through the door. So whether it be a student or a tourist or politicians when they dare to walk in, or sex workers themselves, we're there for it. And it's because we truly believe that the reason sex workers face violence and discrimination is because of the stigma that people have against the sex industry and therefore against sex workers. So we believe by challenging that and trying to reduce that, we actually reduce violence towards sex workers. So yeah, that's what we're here for. I'm a academic in gender violence and conflict. That's my academic background, but I'm also a sex worker myself doing online cam per minute sex work.
Okay. The one in the UK everyone seems to use is adult work. Is it the same over there, or?
No, so the one I use in the, because I'm still kind of having a bit of a swap over, is expanded.
So how did you get into the PIC? Was it just that you wanted to go and work in that space, or you wanted to kind of be more in a supportive position, or?
Yeah, but I was doing my masters, and there was the opportunity to do an international placement, which we had to arrange ourselves. And during my master, well, I started doing sex work during my undergrad, and then from the experiences I had from that, I realized that okay, this is what I want to focus on in my masters. I'm really interested in sex worker power and knowledge distribution, and who gets to say what about sex workers, and who gets seen as the subject, and who gets seen as a credible quote unquote source of knowledge about sex work. So for me, it was really interesting to go there. And during the time, it was during a kind of snapshot in history where there were lots of conversations going on in the area about the erotic centre. And this is what I wanted to focus my master's on. I really wanted to focus on how does the physical and social space of De Wallen, where the red light district is at the moment, compare to what's being proposed by the municipality. So I just messaged them and I said, hey, I'm a student, but I'm also a sex worker. Can I please come and work for you, pretty please? And they said, usually we don't have the time and resources because we're only a small organisation and 70% of our work that we do is voluntary. So, but because you're a sex worker and a student, come on, just come on board. So I did their archive for the PIC, which is accessible for anyone who wants to know about the history of sex work in Amsterdam. And yeah, then was just able to take part in participant observation and walking ethnography and different forms of anthropological methods to get a sense of how de Wallen is both physically, socially, um, and yeah, I think the things that I focused on were physical safety, social cohesion, and agency and autonomy.
Hmm.
How does that compare to what's being proposed? So it was a great site. And then they had the opportunity open for the coordinator. I kind of applied for it thinking, okay, well, this will be good job experience, um, having no idea that I would actually get the job. And yeah, now I'm living in the Netherlands. And here we are.
So, are you Dutch, just for context?
No, I'm English. Yeah, I'm
Okay.
as British as they come.
Okay,
Yeah.
wonderful. My friend's just finished a master in gender studies, and she said it was so because she's stripper, so
Mm,
she said it was very interesting, and it helped her grapple with a lot of things that you just face as a sex worker and stuff. But take it to the start. What is the most common thing people are coming into the PIC for? What kind of questions do you ask? Because I can imagine there's lots of tourists asking strange questions or very generic ones.
yeah, I would say the most common question we tend to get is, have people who work in the windows been trafficked or are they exploited? That is people's main concern, to which we have to, say to them that human trafficking in the red light district is extremely rare because of the legislation that's in place
Mm-hmm.
to basically there are lots of hoops that you have to jump through to be able to work in the windows, and it becomes apparent very quickly in the windows because of how visible it is if someone has been trafficked or exploited into the windows. It's not to say that human trafficking doesn't go on in other parts of the Netherlands, it most certainly does. However, the windows are not the market that traffickers and people who are exploitants are looking to put people into because of how open and obvious it is.
Well, not to say that it's the ultimate thing to stop this, but I know that from my research is that when, say, a girl wants to go and work in a window or a person, because, there's different gendered people in the red
Yes.
light district, they have to go through a question with the person who rents out the window.
Yes.
Yep.
Yep.
And it's harder to almost, in the sense of trafficking, it doesn't lend itself to people who are freelance or self-employed because it's more kind of in the UK, for example, like we have brothels in Soho and central London. That's obviously more of a model where you give a percentage and it's easier to kind of traffic there. But like you said, they have the landlords who ask questions and try and verify. The government seem quite stringent on that, so to speak.
In some ways, yeah. I think the thing that I always say to people who come to our centre and ask about the intake interview, which is what it's called, is that it is not a fail safe method in deterring all human trafficking, because some forms of exploitation and trafficking are very insidious and not very easy to see, and what we define as trafficking can really depend on what we consider abuse and stuff. But what it does do is it completely rules out the ability for people who have come to the country under the circumstances or under the expectation of working in a completely different career. They will know very quickly when they go for this interview that that is not what is taking place at the windows. So, for example, say in a hypothetical situation, we've got someone from Poland who has come to the Netherlands in the assumption that they're going to be working as a babysitter. They will find out very quickly in that intake interview that that's not what's happening. And if that is at all apparent to the window operator, they have to report it.
Yep.
So there are very hefty fines for window operators who have people working in their windows who have been trafficked and exploited, and you can lose your license because of it. So it is not a business model for the window operators either to have someone working in their windows who is trafficked exploited, and they don't benefit from it either, because another thing that people don't understand is that sex workers pay their rent at the beginning of the day, and then window operators do not receive any more income from that sex worker. So they have their rent, and then they don't get a percentage cut. So it's not like they're going to be making any extra off of someone by making someone work harder, or from someone who doesn't work at all.
Yeah.
So I often say to people that if I was to work in the windows and my shift starts at 10, and then I want to go off and have a coffee and not start my shift until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, there's no one telling me I have to start working. You know, the window operators already made their money. They're not bothered whether you turn up to work or not. So it's not a model or a place for trafficking, especially sex trafficking, to take place. Um, and that's also not to say that people who work from hotels, or people who work in escorting, or people who choose to work from home are then trafficked, because I then think that's the assumption that people go to, that if you're not working in the windows, or if you're working in the unregulated sector, then you must be trafficked. That's not the case. It's just a case of that people who are working unregulated are unfortunately more likely to be exposed, or are in more precarious situations, and don't have the ability to report things to the police because it's unregulated. Therefore, they may be more at risk of these things, whereas in the windows, that's massively reduced.
You know, you've got a brothel, you've got a window, you've got kind of what you would describe as a call girl who just comes out and sees a customer in a hotel or at the home. Different models lend themselves to different ways of monetizing them. So at the moment, I work in a strip club where I pay a house fee, which is similar to a window where I'm renting the room or the floor for the night.
Hmm.
I prefer that method, but also I can see in some businesses taking a percentage almost incentivizes the manager to push the girl to work a bit more further, which I do think it works in some places, but also I can see how that can be a bit of an amber light in some ways, you know?
Exactly. The windows aren't for everyone. And some people prefer working in private houses, they prefer working in sex clubs. And I'm not here to say whether or not, where people should work. I think the thing that I have against these forms of sex work is not the sex work itself, but is the way in which the people who operate the clubs and they're called private houses here, indoor brothels, is the amount they charge as a kind of percentage fee. So I know one sex worker who, the client pays 360, and then the sex worker only gets 70 euros of that. And then on top of that, as a sex worker, because you're self-employed, you have to pay your taxes. Some places have what's known as an opt-in system, where the brothel owner or the club owner will pay your taxes for you, so you don't have to worry about that, because taxes in the Netherlands are a absolute minefield. But then they take a little fee for that as well. So for a sexual encounter with a client, you might only be walking away with 45 to 50 euros after you've paid your taxes and everything, which doesn't seem fair when you think about it in comparison to the windows, or even in comparison to independent escorts, which in a lot of places are not legal in the Netherlands. Well, that it's not regulated, it's not allowed in the municipality. So while you get to keep all your money, you have all the danger of not being able to report, or you can report, but then there's a fear of you getting fined or being indicted with charges. So people have to weigh these things up. We all weigh them up, either in the UK, we weigh up, what we're going to do and what do we do if we get in trouble.
I think what's so great about your work is that you're providing information out there. And I think any media pieces where you're directly speaking to the people who are connected to what's happening, it allows people to open up conversations about the women, predominantly women who are in this trade. And I know there's other genders, but having more autonomy over how their businesses run, which I completely agree with. It's not fair that someone takes 20%, okay, of your nightly commission, and then you have to pay 20% of tax. And then if someone does your tax, you have to pay another 10%. Often people from maybe not so much Western countries, there's this thing called the Loverboy method. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Yes, I am
Yeah.
aware of it. Yeah.
Andrew Tate is the clear example at the moment. He would, use this lover boy method of, you probably articulate it a lot better than me, but taking women from different, backgrounds where they're not going to necessarily know as much of the right that they're going to do. And basically, he would say stuff like, oh, I'm going to take 10% of your tax money or something, and I'm going to do your taxes for you. But I think in that country where he was doing it, Romania, he didn't have to do it. So he was just taking an extra 30% off them, which was ridiculous, you know. But the more knowledge people have, I really believe that is better, because they can make a more informed decision about what they're getting into. And when they don't have the knowledge, then I think that's where it gets dangerous, you know?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's there's so many things I could say about that. I think it definitely is, and I think we definitely get a lot of emails from people who are coming into the country and maybe don't know how to work, or how to get involved in the work, or because there's a lot of paperwork you need, and because it's such people often say, oh well, the Netherlands is it's sex work is legalized, and we have to turn around and say, well, really what's happening is it's highly regulated, and depending on what municipality you're in, there are different rules. So if I'm in Amsterdam, I'm allowed to work in Windows, but I'm not allowed to work from home. But if I'm in Tilburg, I'm allowed to work from home, but I'm not allowed to work in Windows because they don't allow them there. And each municipality can change the rules as and when they wish. So you can reach a point where you're just starting to be like, yep, okay, I've got all the rules in place, I'm following the paperwork to a T, and then the municipality can change what's happening. So then you have to either move somewhere else or work, work unregulated. So it's really good that people come and talk to us, because we can kind of give them an updated situation about what's going on and what's likely to change, because we don't want people to go through the stress of getting sorted out, only to find out that in a few months' time the situation's going to change there. And I think what a lot of people also don't realise is that unless in certain circumstances, like for myself, who has an orientation visa, so I'm allowed to work in any industry in the Netherlands, if you come from outside the EU, it's extremely hard to work in the regulated industry. And while we're not there to recommend people work in the unregulated industry, we can kind of give them advice on how to do it in the safest way possible, in a kind of harm reduction method, because we know that people are going to do it anyway. So we might as well give people as much information as possible so that they can do it safely, rather than turn around and say to them, well, actually, no, you can't do that. So that's kind of a lot of what we do as well. Another question that we get is about lover boys and stuff like that. And quite recently I had an interview about that, which the way the interview was written, it kind of twisted what I said in a way that I wasn't happy with, in that it kind of made it out that it's a really common issue in the Netherlands. But actually what we find is that it's no more common in the sex industry than it is in any other industry. One of the people I work with put it perfectly, of if I work in Starbucks all day and I'm earning all this money that I have to give to my boyfriend at home, who sits on the couch and smokes weed all day, people just think I have a shitty boyfriend. But if I'm working in the sex industry doing exactly the same thing and go home to the boyfriend smoking weed on the couch, I've got a pimp. So I also think the conversation we have around lover boys, we also need to apply it to the issues between genders, rather than the issues with the sex industry itself as well. I think the Andrew Tate thing really kind of brought this kind of method to light, but I'm also really scared about what's going to come from it for other sex workers as well. But it also highlights the fact that in Romania, there, as far as I'm aware, sex work in terms of like full service is not legal, and it's very poor legislation around what you can do online as well. And if these services are like we have at the Prostitution Information Centre, we would love for a centre like ours to be available in every country, so that people do know what their rights are, what they can apply for labour-wise, and how to work safely as possible.
It's a hotspot for cam services in Romania, but
Yeah,
maybe that's because the legislation is a bit more loose.
yeah,
Because loose legislation allows people to work in the grey a lot more.
yeah.
But even zooming out in a bird's eye view, the term, I know when doing my research, it's sex worker. People like to be addressed, but I'll just use the word of prostitutes. People don't realize that's such a subjective word too. I mean, someone would never assume that a woman who sleeps with her boss to maybe get a better job, that is a form of prostitution, or a man who marries a woman for her family fortune. It's such a loose term. And then these like little, not little, but like you said, lover boy, it's so hard to define these black and white boundaries within everything. I mean, a lot of people would assume with sex trafficking and this lover boy method, a lot of it is to do with coercion. That's the common word we hear: coercion, coercion, coercion. And would you agree with that as kind of core belief? It's about coercion?
I think so. Um, I think that trafficking and exploitation um, can look very different on any scale, and that it's not usually as black and white as people think it is. And from not only my work working at the PIC, but also my work um, in doing my master's degree in gender violence and conflict, I was very interested in what different forms of human trafficking take place across the world, and why do we place so much value, and why is there so much of a kind of moral high ground for sexual human trafficking than other forms of human trafficking. So I was really interested in, well, it's not that I was interested in it, I think some of the most hideous forms of human trafficking I've ever heard of in terms of like level of abuse and level of violence was in fishing boats that take off the Thai shores and are collecting shrimp and prawns, and usually have immigrant workers on them. Now, these ships tend to throw people overboard. People are being threatened with guns on a daily basis. People are having limbs cut off. Yet, you know, some of the most terrible things you could ever think that humans could do to each other are happening on these boats. But we're not interested in it because we're interested in having cheap prawns and we want cheap shrimp on our table. And even looking at that from my Western perspective, of someone who's already always grown up in a Western country, and seeing that and thinking that's absolutely hideous, why would you go into that work knowing that that could potentially happen? But when speaking to these fishermen, they'd say, well, I have to. There is no other choice. I have to make money. It's not that someone is bashing me over the head and forcing me to go, but I'm being forced by capitalism
Mm.
to work in this industry. And I think that can be the same with any kind of human trafficking that we see. The human trafficking we see these days is very rarely someone being hit over the back of the head, dragged into the back of a van, and taken off to work somewhere where they don't know.
That's like the cartoon version of it.
Exactly. That's
Yeah.
very much the kind of binary victim narrative that we've kind of seen in our head. And it's also not to say that that doesn't happen. It most certainly does. But in most cases, when we look at agricultural trafficking, domestic trafficking, sex trafficking, or what we consider to be human trafficking, what we're actually looking at is people smuggling with varying levels of exploitation.
And slavery.
Exactly. So most of the people who come to work in the sex industry in Europe overall, and Laura Augustin, who is a fantastic academic who I'll share with you afterwards,
Mm-hmm.
did long-term studies of people migrating from the African subcontinent to Europe, and to get an idea of how they navigate what to us can seem like very exploitative situations, and how even in situations where you and I would look at it and think, okay, well, that's definitely trafficking, that's definitely exploitation, the person themselves is aware of this. They're aware they're paying too much money for this person to take them overseas. They're aware that they're going to be getting involved in the sex industry, and they're aware that there is the potential for the abuse, but they do it anyway, and they choose to do this with agency. So I think that
But they should be able to exit whenever they want to.
Yes, exactly. But the thing is like with any form of employment, if you need money, then how easy is it to leave? As someone who used to work in the care industry, which to me was much more exploitative than any kind of sex work I've ever done, in terms of I often didn't know if I was going to leave with my front teeth. I often didn't know what days I would be working. I would often have to work double shifts because team members didn't come in. And
The
I
emotional labour as well.
emotional labor, also being sexually harassed by my boss, also having no kind of support in place emotionally, physically, and also, because I was working in psychiatric care, walking into sometimes very unsafe situations. And, yeah, I could have left, but at the time I had no other qualification. This is pre-university, so it was a case of it's the best thing that I can do to be paid, and if I leave this job, what job am I going to walk into? So yes, I did have a choice, but also capitalism and needing money and needing to pay my bills and not knowing when that next job would appear kept me from leaving that job. um, so I think that I think it's either a case of we all have choice to some degree to leave, but we're all also controlled by our physical circumstances, some more than others, because there are some people who get up every day and go, fuck yeah, work, I can't wait to go, and good for them. Um, but I think most of us, the 99.9% of the world, are working in jobs because we have to, because we've got kids to feed, because we've got, bills that need paying, and we've got, family to support. So I think that what I struggle with is not the fact that there is definitely exploitation within the sex industry across the world, but that the capitalist industry and the workplace at large has exploitation in it. And in Amsterdam, we see way more exploitation within the hospitality industry and within kind of domestic um, living support or agricultural industry in the Netherlands. There are way more human rights violations going on within those workplaces than there is in the sex industry. So that's what I have more of an issue with. And I also think that when we think about other industries that are also exploitative, there is far less of an interest in that than there is in the sex industry, and the ways in which sex work actually offers more independence than, say, working in Starbucks.
Yeah, I mean, if you put sex into any sentence, people's ears are going to prick up,
Yeah,
aren't they?
exactly.
I've actually, in my past job, I worked a lot in fashion. And when we kind of looked into ethically sourcing and sustainability, you'd be appalled by all of the kind of atrocities going on in Bangladesh, India, Cambodia, of sweatshops and child labor and stuff like that was literally locking people in to a building and not letting them leave until X amount of product is sewn. So yeah, it is a global problem, like you're saying, in terms of capitalism and zooming out. But I'm just thinking, like, it's very hard to kind of change something that is so gargantuous. But also, I spoke with a dominatrix recently and I did an interview with her. And I asked her, what's your opinion on, kind of these models where it maybe does kind of allow trafficking a little bit in? And she said, well, look, there's nothing wrong with like a commission based model because in dominatrix it's very much an art where you have to learn and really hone your craft. And she said there's nothing wrong with, a woman who really knows what she's doing, helping people who are just getting started and taking a commission off that. Not extortionate, but just kind of helping and teaching someone how to do the craft. And then they can go off and do it independently when they're at that level. But obviously, trafficking doesn't so much happen in doming because of the nature of it, of the power dynamic. The woman and the dom is in charge,
Mm.
the customer is not in charge, and they clearly communicate and have boundaries. You know, but she said if people had more autonomy and there was more regulation of people being able to decide how they run their businesses within the sex industry, and we're more open to communicate that, it would maybe negate some of the trafficking going on, because trafficking happens a lot underground. And when we think underground, we think it's like a seedy flat in Soho or something. But when we say underground, it's actually quite global. Like, look at the Epstein thing. That's underground, but it's at such a large scale. So I think only by having these conversations of what is fair to everyone will we get to a place where, you know, the work is fair to everyone. I feel like I'm going round in circles and circles.
No, I completely get you though, and I do kind of agree with the dominatrix, but I kind of go for a different method, in that I don't think that we should be regulating things more. I think that actually what we should be looking for is decriminalisation.
Okay.
And that is because in the Netherlands, we are currently working under a regulated system. And the issue with that is that it then defines between those who work legally and have access to all the support. And, you know, very much like dominatrixing in the windows, it's this same power dynamic, in that the sex worker knows that they have access to services and to support and to security, and the client is very aware of that. So clients behave in a completely different manner than they do in unregulated industries. But while you have that legal sector, you also have then the unregulated sector, which is, you know, a little tiny bit of people who may or may be at risk of being trafficked or exploited. But then the much larger part is people who have chosen to work unregulated, but they are in situations of precariousness, in that if they get caught, they can, you know, most landlord agreements in the Netherlands have written into them that if you're found out to be engaging in sex work from this property, we can kick you out. So, you know, you have that, and you also have the fact that depending on the municipality, you can also
Sorry, does that include like OnlyFans and online work?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So, for example, if I was to live in Amsterdam, I would have to rent a separate apartment or a separate residence, not so residence, sorry, separate office building to engage in my online work. But none of us are doing that, because what online worker has the money to afford a separate office in a way?
Yeah.
So, you know, most people have chosen to work in the industry and are working, you know, unregulated. It's the same with independent escorts. A lot of independent escorts are not allowed to work outside of an agency in the Netherlands, but because the agency charges, you know, 2/3 of what you're getting paid by the client, a lot of people choose to work independently. So
That
that
doesn't make sense to me
yeah,
at all. Because, like,
exactly.
why should someone get, okay, let's rephrase your product as like IP, it's your
Yeah,
intellectual property. Why are you taking 2/3 of my IP when I am like, you don't have a business without me? I
yeah,
am the asset. So why
yeah,
are you taking that from me?
yeah.
That to me, for the Netherlands being a really forward country, I don't understand that. But also, how are these like what is acceptable in which municipality? How do they determine that? Is that down to, like, for example, conservatives in one borough deciding, oh, we would like this in our area, and liberals deciding we would like that? Is that the
Pretty much, it's pretty much each municipality then has their own kind of local coalition in a way. Um, And while everyone has to maintain to the national rules, which are kind of seen as like the minimum, these are kind of the minimum safety implements you have to have in place, or the minimum rules. So, for example, nowhere are you allowed to work under 18 as a sex worker, and everyone has to be able to work in the EU to be able to work in the sex industry. So, as long as you have those things in place, then each municipality can decide where sex work takes place, how old in terms of, so for example, Amsterdam, you're not allowed to work in the sex industry if you're under 21.
I
Or,
think that's quite a sensible rule.
I mean, it's sensible, but then it means that anyone who is working in the sex industry who's between 18 and 21, they are automatically at risk of being fined.
Yeah.
So it then pushes the most potentially vulnerable group more underground, rather than having them being able to provide them a safe working space.
Yeah.
Um, so you have these rules, but then what people forget in the Netherlands is we actually have a very prominent Bible Belt here. So there is definitely a part of the Netherlands where, even though having no tolerance laws towards sex work is technically against the law, they make it so difficult for people to get licenses or to people to work in the sex industry that they basically become no tolerance areas, um, which means that you're not allowed to work in sex work legally here, but people do anyway. So my issue there is the fact that if we had decriminalisation where sex workers had the same labour rights that any other workforce does, but you can still keep these laws that protect victims of human trafficking and protect children and stuff like that, then you allow sex workers to choose where, when, and how they work, and take away the fear for all sex workers that they can't call the police or they can't call for help when something bad happens, or that they can't create networks of support and community that, like in the UK, where you can't at the moment have two sex workers working together at the same building, these methods of community protection that we have as well, we are then allowed to engage with without being accused of having a brothel.
Okay.
So we've seen this happen in New Zealand and we've seen this happen in Belgium. And what we've seen is a massive decline in violence towards sex workers and missing sex workers. And also in terms of sex workers' sexual health, rates of, in New Zealand, we don't know in Belgium yet because it's been too soon, but in New Zealand we've seen lower rates of STIs amongst sex workers as well, because people are more able to come forward. And we also see people reaching out and getting help when they need it more.
I mean, we've got a whole segment of the benefits of having a more sex positive and sex work positive country, which is its own thing. But I guess my question to you, with you saying that there's quite a strong Bible belt, I mean, do you think like having like a religious monopoly on the morality of sex workers, I I don't understand how you couldn't ever say that belongs in creating a stable society, because how is someone's belief more important than psychology and science and logic? So shock horror, I believe in a lot of atheist principles, but how does one religion, even if it's in a voting system, I can maybe get on board with that if so many people vote that. How do they get the morality on that of someone else's experience? I don't understand that.
I think because in the Netherlands there is kind of a dismissal of religion in a weird way, in that while there is a Bible Belt, Amsterdam, Utrecht, Rotterdam, they claim to be very logical and how do we say it? Not problematic, but they are problematic. But what I mean is pragmatic.
Yeah.
Leaders of these cities, not realizing how, even as myself, as someone who's a sex worker and someone who is extreme, likes to think of myself as quite liberal in term and quite radical thinking, are still influenced by these religious undertones that come through institutions. And especially in Amsterdam, our mayor, Femke Halsema, has this idea of the erotic centre and how that's going to protect sex workers. But this is very much based in her own views of how undignifying she finds the windows, how undignifying she sees people, and I would say people stood in the windows and people going by and looking at them, because it conflicts with her own inner morality. It conflicts with her own inner feminism that's very influenced, and we see this with a lot of white feminism, very influenced by this sort of missionary narrative, this kind of Christian idea that, we as white women need to go and save those who are less fortunate than us.
And take our work away from us.
Exactly.
Even though they've never stepped foot in a strip club, brothel, or window.
Exactly. Or they have, but they didn't like it. But it's the politics of ick. It's this idea of,
Ick.
they can't. Yeah, the politic. It's literally called the politics of ick, where they can't imagine doing our work, so therefore no one else should do it. But my idea of hell is working in a Starbucks. you know, but I would never stop someone else from doing it because everyone's got to eat.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. And I think we also see this with, you know, a lot of, you know, feminist organizations who go across the world and try and stop people from working in brothels in, say, India or Thailand, and then get them working in a bag making factory. Well,
Same shit,
yeah,
different.
exactly, different
Yeah.
environment. You know, we're all working with our bodies, we're just all being exploited in different ways.
We're all
um
mercenaries, even
yeah,
if it's not of our free will or our free will.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So I think that this lack of reflexiveness um, is what stops a lot of Dutch politicians and municipality workers from seeing the contradiction in what they believe will make sex work safer,
Mm.
and is what is actually scientifically proven to make sex work safer.
And I think the only way to calm down this like religious side, like I fully admit, you know, someone in the 80s not going to change their opinion on much, you
Mm,
know. It's just if you've got a grandparent, you know, there's very few things they'll change their opinion on.
mm,
But I think only through humanizing like what sex workers do and anyone around that industry, even like you said before, the people who rent out the window, I'm sure they get called pimp all the time, you know. Only by like humanizing and explaining and showing what the industry is actually like is the way to get people who don't maybe agree with you on board. It's having that dialogue, you know. It's not a partisan issue, I think, but also a really kind of good diagram I've just got up on my screen that I saw on Reddit because I'm on Reddit a lot and I know not everything on there you should read, but you know, it says, why is religion fixed on sex? And it has this little sign where it says shame, then it points, no, it says sex, then it points to shame, then it points to control. And it's like this three-pronged cycle where you can use sex to shame people and then gain control so they can get validation through that
mm,
religion, which is, I think, where I found a lot of my atheist morality through so
yeah.
much. Not to say all religions are like that and controlling. Like I know the Jewish community have some quite interesting points in the Jewish scripture. They think
Torah, yeah.
Torah. They believe that a woman should keep on being pleasured beyond after procreating because they
Mm,
believe that harvests are really fruitful and happy household when the
mm,
woman is pleased and has pleasure, which you know is a nice thing to hear. But I think, in my opinion, a lot of religion is used to control sex.
yeah, I think that I have several different angles on this. I think that, especially where I live at the moment, is one of these very religious no tolerance areas. But from sex workers that I work with, they say that the clients they see around this area are some of the freakiest people out there. So I think it's also this religious oppression of sex actually ends up backfiring in that those who are the most religiously repressed end up having, you know, the
Kinks.
yeah, the biggest kinks, the biggest outward need um, to, engage in different sexual services, or have different sexual needs that need to be fulfilled. But I also think that um, I myself, have an interesting background with religion, which I could spend a whole other podcast talking about. But in Amsterdam, the Oud Kerk, which is just outside of the Prostitution Information Centre, originally was a Catholic church before the Protestant Reformation, and the saint of that church is actually the saint of sex workers and sinners, and that church has actually taken a real stand in the community, and we work quite closely with the church now, and they do lots of different events within the church about how sex workers belong in this community, and about how being a religious person is accepting sex workers in society. When we think particularly about Christianity, and we think about Mary Magdalene, some people argue that she was the 13th disciple in a way. You know, she was just as close to Jesus as the other 12 of them were. And Jesus never shamed her, he never forlorned her. And therefore, sex workers should be respected within society. And quite recently, on the 27th of August, we had Queer Pride Day in Amsterdam, which was specifically dedicated to sex workers. And we actually had the peep show hoes do stripping inside the church. So there is definitely areas which are changing. Um, and I also really like this idea that people can still have their religion and still respect sex workers in a way, and that there are very few religions I've ever read about or come across, like anthropologically, that don't have some connection or some story in them about sex work. And when we think of a lot of the ancient religions, sex workers were gods, or, you would have disciples of the church or the temple, which, were, basically would, provide sexual services to people who came to the church. So I I don't like living in a world where people push their religion and suggest that I am somehow wrong or other sex workers are wrong. But I also don't think that is a case of, like, we have sex workers who are religious as well. There are lots of Christian sex workers working within the red light district, or people who follow, whatever religion, and people who are religious. I think they can overlap, and also you can be religious and still see sex workers as autonomous, respectable people. So it's really interesting that you brought up the religious sector, because this is something I constantly am trying to contend with. And actually, a lot of the stigma that sex workers face in Amsterdam is coming from people who say that they're not religious at all. Which
Hypocrites.
exactly, which I also wonder, can anyone who's grown up in a society not be religious at all, in terms of, like, religion informs our institutions like education and health and government and law. So while you may not believe in a religion, we are influenced by it constantly.
I
So
think I think you would look at yourself and myself and obviously describe us as liberal, but
mm,
still, we've been conditioned by society, and I still have a bit of what I would call toxic religion
mm,
bias, where I think that if I sleep with a man on the first date and I give up my virtue, then that devalues me in
how
some
dare you?
deep way.
Exactly.
Like
We still carry
Madonna
those things
complex.
around. Yeah. And we still have, self stigma amongst the sex worker community. Um, and there is definitely sex workers who place themselves higher on the table than other sex workers.
Strippers love to do
Um,
that.
yeah. And, we see it with, high class escorts as well. Just the name high class, suggests something, doesn't it? Or, I sometimes see on Twitter, um, quote unquote high class escorts saying, "Oh, I don't need to use condoms with my clients because I have, two clients, or I have, you're my one special client. Sugar babies do this as well." Um, you know, so there is definitely that kind of
Gold digger.
yeah, there is that self discrimination. There's that kind of hierarchy of who is more of a pure sex worker, um, who is less, kind of, and I'm saying this as kind of paraphrasing, but who is less of a dirty sex worker, or, less of a messy sex worker. And we're only harming ourselves by doing that, because, by suggesting that some of us are better than others, you're just, if you at one point reach a point where you actually can't do high class escorting anymore, you can't do stripping, or you can't do burlesque dancing, whatever, um, kind of payout you have, and you have to then start doing that, then you have to deal with that shame all over again. And um, you're isolating yourself from community as well, which I also think is something that happens where people don't like to identify themselves. not just publicly, but they don't like the term sex work, or they don't want to see themselves as a sex worker, because then that means you're piling yourself in with all these other sex workers that you don't agree you belong in their group.
I think when I first started dancing, the term sex work, why it kind of didn't put me off, because obviously here I am, but why it made me go, ooh, is because to my virgin ears that hadn't been in the industry, I thought someone was going to assume that would I was having sex, you know. I mean, people like to think strippers are like banging people in private rooms. That's really not what we're doing.
Yeah.
But, you know, not that there's anything wrong with that. I actually think, you know, full service is actually probably more honest, as I said, than maybe a sugar baby or a gold digger or something. But I think explaining it to like a parent or explaining it to a friend who doesn't understand, I can understand how the word sex just immediately throws them off. But I just guess we need to get more used to the word and more warm with it and understand it a bit more.
Yeah, and I completely get that. When I first started doing Cam by Minute, you know, I didn't associate with sex work because I'm like, well, I'm not actually in
Bang it.
physical contact with anyone. No, everything I do is online, and very little of what I do is, you know, penetrative kind of work. And but I think it's the assumption people have when you talk about Cam by Minute or OnlyFans or whatever kind of sex work you're doing that binds us together in a way. It's the assumption that you must be easy, or you are loose in some way, or you know you're kind of these assumptions about being and I hate to gender stereotype, but a good time girl. When actually you can be the complete opposite of that. I think that's what binds us together. And I hate to say this in to kind of bring down the tone of, the podcast, but if any one of us, depending, no matter whether you're doing online sex work or whether you're doing in-person service, if we were to be murdered one day, what the paper would say about us is what binds us together. It's that the first thing that would be brought up is not how terrible your death was. It would be what you did for a living. And, how somehow that makes you being killed more acceptable in society. And I think that is what binds us politically together. And I would never want to force someone who doesn't associate with the term sex work to use it as an identifier or as an identity. If you don't want to be part of that group, that's absolutely fine. It's better to be part of it because you might need community one day. And as sex workers, as a group, there may not be people outside of that community who understand what you're going through. If you go to someone who's not in the community one day and says, oh, I really fucking hate my job, I'm having a really shit day, this happened with a client, the first thing they'll do is tell you to quit. Whereas we know that that's, not always possible. Whereas if you go to someone in community and tell them about your shit client, then they'll have other ways of supporting you and taking care of you, or, giving you advice on what to do.
And also,
go on.
if anyone's feeling guilty about the word, sex work, let's spin it on its head. Let's call, because obviously there's an industry for it. We wouldn't be here if there wasn't an industry. Why don't we just say, like, there is a massive market for sex consumers, people in the sexual marketplace. Before you started camming, you probably didn't realize the guy next to you on the bus subscribes to OnlyFans. Your uncle pops into a strip club. Your old school friend, he has like a thing for going to see girls in the window. You don't realize how much you're not actually alone, and there's such a vast sexual economy.
Definitely. I think there is both, and one of the things we talk to about students at the PIC is that there is both an elusiveness about who the client is and a monstrosization of them. So we have both where we're not talking about who is the sexual client, and that therefore that is then creating a kind of image of the client, which is one of danger, one of nastiness and one of, kind of a man lurking in a dark alley, this kind of Jack the Ripper narrative in a
Yeah.
way.
Are they
um
called Johns?
yeah, people can call them Johns. I prefer clients because I think um
What if you're actually a John?
yeah, if you're a John, you can be called John. That's fine. But I always get a bit suspicious of people called John Smith. It's just like, okay. Um, but no, I think it's, and one of the things I say to students is, have you ever watched online porn? And most of them will kind of sheepishly put their hands up, and it's like, well, congratulations, you're the client of sex workers. Um, the thing
True.
is, though, you're probably not paying for that porn, and that porn has probably been stolen. So you're the unethical client of a sex worker, and you should really be paying for your porn. So, I try and get them to humanize who the client is, because I also think the stigma of the sex worker as the victim and the client as the monster are interlinked in a way.
I mean,
And go on.
no, you finish. Sorry.
Yeah. So I think once we start to humanize who the client is, it's easier to humanize who the sex worker is as well, and vice versa. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that some of the most horrific cases we've heard of, where sex workers have been murdered or viciously attacked, are not by people who are regular clients,
Mm-hmm.
but are people who are what we call posing as clients. So they have no intention of paying the sex worker, or they have no intention of having sex with the sex worker. So they are not who the normal client base is. Clients are paying customers. And people who tend to pay, and people who have no problem showing their ID, and people who behave, I do not believe should be lumped into the same category as people who intentionally go out to hurt and not pay sex workers. And
Yeah.
what we need to separate that category, the same as we separate people who are engaged in sex work and people who are humans, victims of exploitation. They're separate
Mm.
categories completely. Um,
It,
yeah,
it's almost like worker, customer, and then if you're, as long as you're not hurting anyone, that's not a bad thing. But when you're
no,
hurting someone, and even I've seen some strippers be very relentless, and I'm like, you
yeah,
should be doing that to the customer. But basically, anyone who's imparting hurt, that's obviously a clear way to look at abuse within
yeah,
this dynamic,
exactly.
No.
Exactly. The
Even
same
if,
as any working relationship. If I'm, if I'm a home, um, if I'm an estate agent and I'm showing a client around a new house, no one sees that relationship as anything, where exploitation could take place. But as soon as that client, touches me inappropriately or behaves violent to me, that contract has ended.
mm,
That agreement we had has completely ended, and you have entered the realm of abuse. um, it is exactly the same with sex work. No matter what sex work it is, you have a clear defined agreement of what is going to take place, and if the sex worker takes away her consent and you pursue forward, or you do something that you behave violently, that contract has ended.
mm,
But I think what a lot of people think is, oh well, you put yourself in that situation, there is the potential that was going to happen. So, whatever happens next is a occupational hazard. But we would never say the same to a home hairdresser. We would never say the same to someone who is an estate agent going into people's houses.
mm.
Um,
I mean, to dial it back to religion,
mm,
right now we can objectively say that's abuse of power, that's abuse of power. And where, like, as we said before, religion gets this kind of morality complex of telling, I'm sure they have like things to say about capitalism too, like it's
mm,
not just sex work. But like, for example, look at the Catholic Church and like the pain that's happened with abuse in there. And I mean, if you're listening to this, you probably know, like, what that's about. How can someone hurt someone in that capacity and then say, oh, it's written into a Bible and the abuse is, no, not a Bible, well, the abuse is written into my religious scripture and that's what makes it okay. That just gives people a free pass to do whatever they like.
But the hypocrisy of man is something that will continue to fascinate me until the day I die. We have politicians in the Netherlands who are adamant anti-sex work, yet they're on client group pages. Sex workers have got them in their WhatsApp chats as, either dodgy clients or as people who are regular clients. And I think it's two things. I think it's the want to repress sex workers so that they can't get help, or they can't blackmail politicians because they can't come forward and say, hey, this person has been receiving sexual services from me, because the sex worker themselves is in more trouble than the client.
Big up Stormy Daniels.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. America is the perfect example, where you have full criminalization of the sex worker. In the Netherlands, while it's a very different system, we're now starting to go into this. We're now starting to. I don't know if you've heard about it, but the Dutch government is trying to push this WRS, which is basically mandatory sex worker registration. So they want to move the red light district, but kind of at national politics, they want to all sex workers to be registered and for this information to be available on a public database, so that clients then have the responsibility to check that if they are hiring a sex worker, that they are registered on this database. So we're moving more into this kind of neo end demand model, in a way, where the client becomes the criminalized partner in a way. And yet this is seen once again to be reducing child exploitation. It's once again seen to be, reducing human trafficking. But the argument that we've been pushing and that I've been pushing is that people don't accidentally sleep with children. They don't accidentally sleep with victims of human trafficking. The people who are looking for this type of experience, they search for it. And having a system where you're registering people who, because this registration, people only register people who are allowed to work in the Netherlands. So you're not keeping track of the underground market anyway. If anything, you're just pushing people further and further into that. So it's really, like I said, the hypocrisy will constantly fascinate me. It terrifies me, but it fascinates me as well. How we know by looking at places which do have registration, and this has been experimented on in the north of Holland, in Groningen, they have this registration model, and they have this end demand model in Sweden, which has been going on for the last 10 years. It doesn't reduce trafficking, it doesn't reduce human exploitation, and actually it worsens the position of sex workers.
Do you know the actor Ashton Kutcher?
Yes.
And I wish, like you said, the government would just look at this company called Thorn that he has, which is a software that basically is more orientated around going into the deep web and finding this criminality going on in there, rather than getting these people above the surface who aren't really worth getting. Like, why don't you focus on the actual root rather than the surface level thing?
Exactly. It's almost like there is more of a focus and criticization of legal and regulated methods, which, don't get me wrong, could be better.
In every industry.
Yeah, in every industry. Rather
like the
than
prawn one.
actually, exactly, rather than focusing on where human trafficking and where exploitation is actually taking place. But I think in the Netherlands, in particular, that they have kind of been, given this status as being a human trafficking hub. And while that happens in lots of industries, sex industry is where people are focusing on. And the Netherlands government and municipalities are terrified of this accusation. So they're attacking the most visual forms of sex work, which also tend to be the safest. and saying, right, this is what we're doing to make it safer. This is what we're doing to regulate this. You know, we're making it stricter, so it's even harder for traffickers to get in there. Not realizing that actually that's like you're casting your net in the wrong end of the pond. You know, it's that the exploitation is happening out there. It's not where the spotlight is, and you need to be doing it out there. But the world media and, you know, people who, you know, radical feminist groups that are against, you know, human trafficking or claim to be against human trafficking are way more focused on these more visual methods of the sex industry than they are on what's actually taking place.
Well, there's also this idea that, you know, for example, we see the movement to OnlyFans from mainstream porn. I think that's so much better than what we had before, than getting a flat fee for doing a video and you don't really get compensation. I know OnlyFans take a percentage, but people think with the birth of, truly in the pandemic, of people having more autonomy over sex work and being able to partake in it more and maybe having more confidence and means to do it, people think that's the death of traditionalism and the nuclear family, because, oh my God, all of our wives are going to realize they have sexual IP and they can go and make money. You know, not every woman's going to run away from their family and go and like make loads of money on OnlyFans.
No. And the method doesn't suit everyone either. You know,
No.
like the reason I do Cam by Minute instead of OnlyFans is because I have ADHD and I don't have the concentration for content making. You know, like I like people look at it and they're like, oh, you know, why don't you go and do a real job? Have you ever tried to schedule for like content creation? I mean, you're a podcast maker, you know exactly of how difficult it is. But like for me, I prefer the fact that with my work, I do my work, I log off, and I'm done. I don't have to think about anything, and I don't have to worry about subscribers. I don't have to worry about creating content. Like, it's hard work, you know. And then you've also got to, you know, navigate about the fact that your image might be out in the public everywhere, which I do with mine as well.
See, that's why I don't do it, because I'm not, it's funny, I'm doing a podcast, but obviously this is audio. I'm personally not ready for that, but that suits me. Yeah.
No, exactly. And you know, I've also never, you know, also negotiated with myself about what kinds of sex work I would be okay with doing and what I wouldn't be okay with doing. And you know, I've spoken to other sex workers about it. So I have a friend who's an escort worker, and you know, sometimes she does 2 day free day, um, you know, like client visits. And I say to her, I like, how do you do it? Like, how, not because like the work is dangerous or anything, but like if I had to be with a client for more than 3 hours, I think I would die of boredom. So it's just like, how do you deal with those situations? And she says, oh, well, there's loads of ways you can deal with it. You know, I couldn't do what you do and sit in front of a camera for, you know, 2-3 hours a day. I'd go absolutely nuts. And it's like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, actually. And once again, it highlights that, not kind of stigma in our community, where it's like, oh, I can do my sex work, but I couldn't do that sex work. And actually, when you realize the ways in which your own sex work is hard and why someone else has not chosen how to do that, you know, personally, I, you know, wouldn't work in the windows, but that is simply because you need to be able to uphold your boundaries in the windows. And I'm too British for that. I'm too soft. Whereas I
Dutch
know
people are not soft.
definitely not. And I think to work in the windows, you do need to be very clear about what you're offering, what price you'll take, and not back down on that either.
I went into the Wallen and I went into the red light district, and I actually did have some conversations with some of the girls in preparation for this. And they told me about prices, and I don't know what the euro to the pound is at the moment, or the dollar.
Yeah.
But for me, some of them said higher prices, some of them said lower prices. But on the lower prices, knowing what I could make in a club, you know, people might do sex work because they actually enjoy the sexual part of it and they love that. But to me, I didn't get the price of some of the prices that were being given out. Like 50 as a minimum for one interaction. To me, it should be higher, personally.
Yeah. It's definitely, a lot of sex workers are now in the windows charging higher prices. So for a long time, it was, nothing less than €50 for 15 minutes. That was kind of the community rule. And this was because, you had clients who were going around and saying, oh, but her over there is doing it for 30, or her over there is doing it for 20. So it was kind of like, if everyone agrees that nothing is going to happen for less, then we don't underprice each other.
Yeah.
Because there's no rule about how little can be priced. It's more just kind of an agreement. But also, if you're being charged €200 for your room a night, then you need to be charging enough that you make your money back in a way. Whereas now, most sex workers in the area are saying, right, nothing less than 70 for 15 minutes. And this is because that €50 hasn't changed since the 80s. Like, inflation's gone up, but sex work has not, in a way. But you're still, we still get visitors, we still get clients coming in and going, I'm not paying €70 for 15 minutes. It's like, well, go somewhere else then.
When they come into a strip club and say, oh, I'm not going to give you 60 for 3 dances, I go, okay, right, okay, because they want the real thing.
Yeah.
And then they go and say that to someone who is giving the real thing, in commas, like, it just shows it never ends. They're always trying to haggle you, bargain you, Not all of them, but
the thing is that I find is that if everyone has a united front, and if everyone says, nope, this is it, if you don't like it, go and see someone else, they come back round. And I've, heard of clients doing it where they'll say, oh, well, so-and-so's charging this. It's like, go to her then, if that's what she's charging. And then they come back round 5 minutes later. So I think the thing is that the demand is always going to be there, and that the price will always be matched in some ways.
But that united front, it treats them like a baby, which is good, because it's like, okay, you don't want to engage, we're not going to give you contact or any engagement until you come correct and you know what the price is.
Exactly. And I also think that's also kind of what makes the power dynamic so different in Wallen in comparison to other red light districts across the world. Is like, look, you can stand outside my door knocking and shouting and, getting annoyed as much as you want, but I'm going to press this little alarm bell and the window operator is going to come down and he's going to bring a police officer with him, so you can either calm down and move along, or you're going to get moved along. And that gives sex workers, no matter their height, no matter how much they weigh, so much power, and most clients behave impeccably well. In fact, most clients are a little bit scared of sex workers. They're quite shy creatures, all in all. And we have, not ridiculously, though, because non-violence shouldn't be ridiculous, but in comparison to other forms of sex work and in comparison to other areas in the world, violence in the windows is incredibly low.
Because it's more open.
Because sex workers have autonomy over who they see for what amount, and the fact that you have frequent clients walking by. You as a sex worker can say, no, I'm not going to see that person. They don't meet my standards, and I know someone else is going to come along in 5 minutes.
Choice of selection.
Exactly, choice of selection, the ability to know that not only your window operator and the police, but the community will stand up for you as well. So you are an entrepreneur if you work in the windows, the same as the florist, the same as the cafe owner. And I've seen florist and cafe owners come outside and yell at tourists for taking photos and say, hey, you shouldn't be doing that.
No, or tapping on the window. It's
exactly.
Not an animal.
No, exactly. Tapping on the window, luckily I've never seen, because people would go mad at it. But even the sex workers themselves, they won't put up with it. I know one sex worker who keeps a bucket of dirty mop water by her window, and if someone tries taking a picture of her, she'll throw it at them. And the thing is that you can call the police, but they'll turn around to you and say, well, what did you think was going to happen? You try taking a picture of someone in their underwear without their permission, like, what is going to happen?
Well, period. Imagine I'm working at a desk and you just come and take a random picture of me. That's weird.
It's a nightmare in Amsterdam, though, because it's technically not against the law, because you're in a public space.
Mm.
And the windows inhabit this weird public-private area. So while the municipality is happy to ban people pissing on the street and they're happy to ban people drinking in public or smoking weed in public, they won't put a ban on people taking pictures of sex workers. They'll say not to do it. They'll create campaigns that say, you know, you shouldn't do this, but there's no fine for it.
Well, I was going to say, let's go back a few centuries to how the Netherlands or Holland
Mm,
have always constructed their laws around the red light district, because it's kind of a tale as old as time. You know, Amsterdam was quite a big port, wasn't it? Like for
mm,
people coming in, and the sailors would come in, and these women would offer this service, wouldn't they, for the people passing through. But I didn't realize that they had, I mean, it probably wasn't perfect, but in Napoleon times, when he was there, you can probably describe it better than myself, but he saw the value in having prostitution for all intents and purposes there in society. And he didn't fight it or any of the religious affiliations with it. In fact, he said that, well, not him personally, but like the cabinet or however they were governing it at the time, that they should be able to go for a sexual health test that was equivalent back then of what one would be. And if they get infected, they should stop working and gain their health. And when they're obviously healthy, they should be able to work. Now, I don't think I've got that word perfect, but I don't know.
you're not far off. You're not far off. So, Amsterdam's history with sex work, I think people have always thought that it went from criminalisation to legalisation. But, you know, for the past 900 years, it's been an up and down story of, you know, persecution, criminalisation, legalisation, regulation. And, you know, before the Protestant Reformation, Amsterdam was a Catholic city. So this is kind of from the 12th century right up until about the 16th century. And weirdly enough, because, you know, we often think of Catholics as not being the best friends of sex workers, but they were actually quite tolerant of sex work for the time. So,
Well, you can always confess.
yeah, exactly. As long as you confess on a Sunday, then you're all good. Um, so, you know, sex work was kind of very public at that time, and as long as you weren't causing massive public disturbance, then you could kind of get away with offering service in music houses, in brothels, in theatre places, kind of like what we saw early, you know, early centuries in the UK. But then when you had the Protestant Reformation, there kind of came this more strict ideology around sex work, and this kind of, you know, when we go into kind of the 17th century, we see this victim narrative. Sorry, 17th, 18th century, we see this victim narrative of, you know, it's not only morally incorrect women, but this could actually endanger our middle class and our respectable women. This is something like that's like a disease that they could be sucked into.
Because it takes them out of the traditional role.
Exactly. And then when Napoleon came, like you said, he came very much with this idea of, you know, we should regulate sex work. And, you know, if we license sex workers and have them checked regularly for STIs, then that's a better system, especially for our military, than not having them checked. But some of the things that were wrong with this is, unfortunately, you know, what we know of 18th century STI testing is that it was pretty redundant in
Mm.
that doctors didn't really know what they were looking for. There wasn't really any kind of treatment for things like syphilis or gonorrhea or chlamydia. And
Didn't Napoleon die of syphilis?
I'm not sure. He might have done. A lot of people did. It was, yeah, there was pretty much no one in Europe during like the 16th to the, you know, 19th century who didn't have syphilis. It was really rampant. But you know, even people who had genitals that were not what the doctor considered normal could be diagnosed with an STI which they didn't have. So what then happened is that a lot of sex workers avoided registration and avoided testing. So it then meant that, you know, people were going around and working anyway, but being scared of being caught because they could be thrown into what was known as the spin house, which is literally what it says on the tin. It's a house of spinning, and it was kind of seen as like reformative justice. So you would go there, you would spin some wool, and then you'd be allowed out. But it almost had a very kind of bedlam feel to it, of that as a middle class citizen you could pay to go in there and make fun of whoever was in there. So it was kind of like a really kind of, barbaric form of entertainment for the middle classes in the Netherlands. And then once Napoleon left, he took those laws with him. So it went back to a more repressive, more moralistic regulation of sex work, which basically prohibited it.
When
And
did?
go on.
Oh, sorry.
No, so
Continue.
then what happened is in 1911 we had what's known as the morality laws, which wasn't the criminalization of sex work, but was the criminalization of any kind of third party. So this was anyone who was seen to be potentially supporting sex workers. So, brothel owners, theatre owners, music house owners, or even landlords, even husbands could be accused of being third party intervention. So it then stripped sex work from the public space, and sex workers then had to work in private spaces. And this is where we see the windows beginning to be used as a form of advertising services. So, as you know, you've been to Amsterdam. One of the beautiful things about the architecture there is the windows are huge. Especially in the old buildings, especially in Protestant areas, which means they work as a great advertising platform for sex workers. And one of my favourite stories that I read about during my research is about a lady called Antwerp Griet, who cut a hole out of the curtain, threaded it with golden thread, and would just stick her elbow out of it and wiggle it. And that was enough for people to know that she was offering sexual services. So she must have had a really sexy elbow. But yeah, and obviously then during World War II, we went back to this regulated method. So the Nazis unfortunately invaded the Netherlands, and they brought with them this regulation of sex work. And one of the things I would really love to do as a PhD study is study the history of sex workers and who was sent out of the sex worker community to concentration camps, because we know it was happening, because they were seen as socially undesirable. So it would be really interesting to see who who was seen as necessary for the Nazi cause and who was sent away in terms of sex workers, and also what happened to sex workers afterwards in the Netherlands, after the war's finished. And obviously, if you were a sex worker and you were seen to be quote unquote collaborating with the Nazis, you were publicly banished. And this is an area I think that we know very little about.
Even though, as well, people from any military background, whether you look at like a Nazi or a British army, they all use what they call a red sparrow,
Mm,
which is like sending over a woman or a man who is an agent of seduction to seduce information, whether that be through just low level seduction or sex.
yeah,
But they're gonna do it on the other side
yeah.
of
I
people.
never thought of that, but you could also consider, Red Sparrow sex workers, in that is the ply of their trade,
Mm.
in a way. But yeah, so then we had that, and then it wasn't until once the Nazis left, we went back to this morality law, and it wasn't until the 2000s that, yeah, October 2000, that this law of nearly 90 years was changed, and that's when we had the brothel ban lifted, which meant that the windows, which were already very well established in Amsterdam and had kind of been tolerated, were legalized, and other forms of sex work were legalized in the Netherlands as well.
I mean, it's very interesting because the Netherlands is acknowledged as a very forward facing country on the tin. And it is by nature, but also it's interesting listening to you of all these kind of more intricate parts of the puzzle that are changing. But also the Netherlands, it's a very kind of, if you look at Europe, it's a very sex positive country in
Mm,
comparison, if they're dealing with things in terms of shame or shame around sex. people who are having sex for the first time. I think I read somewhere that most teenagers or young adults who have sex for the first time reported it in a Dutch statistic company, I can't remember, that their experiences are pleasurable and they're fine with their experiences and they're happy with them, which was, I think it was 70%, which is quite high if you think about it. I mean, in the UK, you know yourself, we have such an attitude of let's not speak about it, let's not talk about it, let's keep sex education just to the classroom and that's it. But by quite a lot of metrics, the Netherlands seems to be quite forward facing in terms of sexual education too.
But you've hit the nail perfectly on the head there of sexual freedom and ability to, the right to sex is something that's very much celebrated here in the Netherlands. And the fact that, the Netherlands, I think, and I might be wrong about this, but was the first country in Europe to legalize gay marriage or civil ceremonies. They do take this kind of independence, liberty, individuality, and the ability to freely conduct yourself very seriously. But it's the monetization of sex which I think hits a trigger nerve, because then there's almost this idea that, well, if you're having sex for money, then you might not be having sex with someone because you want to. It's that, and that's often a question I get. Do people do this for money or do people do this because they want to? And I say, well, how many of us work because we want to? Or if we had the choice of staying in bed all day, or if I had the choice of getting up and painting instead of working, what would I do? Those things can't be separated in a way of like, yes, I do the jobs I do because I want to do them, and I'm lucky and I'm privileged enough that I got to have some sort of decision over my jobs, but I do them because I need money. If I could run around all day living my cottagecore lifestyle dream, then I'd much rather do that. But
I mean, we should always work towards it.
that should be the dream. And I love this idea of having like a very cottagecore sex worker retirement home where we're all just baking pies and like telling each other like funny stories. But that's not that's as much, it's a dream. So I don't think that, and I think that's what is very difficult to separate in the Dutch psyche, and the fact that the Dutch also really appreciate a clear definition between work life and home life.
Yeah, they're quite good with even office hours.
Yeah. And that comes very much with the Protestant, mindset of, you have work and then you have home, you have the public and the private sphere. Sex work blurs that, because sex is seen as private and money is seen as public. And even the space of the windows blurs that kind of perception in this kind of public-private middle ground, in that, you're obviously very public, but you're in what's considered private clothing. And you're very much, available, but you also have your privacy. You also, the doors do not open unless you open them.
It's grey.
Yeah, exactly. It's this grey moral ground that I think people, especially the windows, brings a lot of contention up.
But I think it's important that maybe, I'm British, so the UK take notes of, countries like the Netherlands, Sweden. Apparently Finnish people are the most horny people because they report the highest rates of sexual satisfaction.
Yeah.
But basically, I wish we could more adopt this idea of sex is like recreation and it's fun when we speak about it and we communicate it and, have all those boundaries that we should have.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes because we have so much guilt about, this deep religious thing of sinning and what our parents have taught us and what their parents taught us, sometimes you can have sex with someone and just see it as recreation and fun and not just this arbitrary thing,
I think it's also, I think what is also a really hard thing to contend with, and that we definitely see this when I get students from Norway and I get students from Sweden that, you know, are coming from a criminalize the client model or stop demand model or the
Mm.
Nordic model. Is that,
Nordic.
yeah, Nordic model they call it, but the Danish don't like it when we call it this because they don't follow it.
Okay.
But yeah, we usually call it the Nordic or the Swedish or the stop demand, which is like the criminalizing the client. And you know, the students themselves report, you know, sexual freedom and, you know, being very, you know, educated on
Mm.
sex. But they have this, you know, it's almost this idea that sex work is the cornerstone of particularly female exploitation, and therefore there's not a reality in which sex work is not exploitative
Mm.
of, in particular, women. And it always tends to focus on this idea of, you know, cis women and sex work being
Yeah.
exploitative. They're never concerned about trans sex workers. They're never concerned about sex workers who are men. It's particularly women. Um,
Because we're seen as more vulnerable ones as
we're
well.
seen as more vulnerable, and there's also a virtue that is placed upon our sexuality. I
Well,
had an argument with a student once who said, you know, I'm also a self-employed person, but I could never imagine engaging in sex work. And I said, well, this is my reality. This is what I do. And, you know, she said, oh, well, I don't mean to offend you. It's just I see that area as so personal, so private, and as so, you know, somewhere I couldn't just let any person into. And I said, well, that's absolutely fine for you. And I would never want you to let someone into that space that you didn't want to. However, I have a different idea about
different
what
life experiences.
different life experiences, and also what is, you know, I am quite happy to let people see, you know, my genitals and to you know, let them into that part of myself. I don't see that part of me as sacred. What I see as sacred is my mind. And you know,
Yep.
you've got to be a certain type of person to be allowed past the kind of, you know, the layer that is my mind. However, you in your job, with the job that you provide, you know, you are letting people into that space, and that is absolutely fine. We all use our bodies for work. It's just I don't hold the same values about certain parts of my body that you do. Um, and it's realizing, like you said, and you know, this all ties back to religion, that this kind of radical feminist idea, or this kind of liberal feminist idea, it ties back to these religious ideas about what parts of our bodies we should be valuing, what parts of our body are sacred, and what exploitation looks like on a specifically female body. Um, and I think it's just really interesting how a lot of these radical feminists and liberal feminists would claim to be so far from religion, claim to not fall into those stereotypes, but actually, when it comes to sex work, they fall right back into those traps.
Hypocrites.
Yes, exactly.
I think what you just said about the mind is so interesting because it resonates exactly with me.
mm,
My school of thought of why I felt okay with stripping was because, you know, unfortunately, as a young girl, before you're 18, you're going to be sexualized. You know, I remember I was in a school uniform and a British gas man said I'd hang out at the back end of that when I was in my school uniform, which is horrible to
oh,
think about it. No matter how old you look, you're still in a school uniform.
yeah.
And just various things. You have your own encounters of, you know, sexual harassment. But I thought, you know what, if I want to ask for profit of people looking at me and, you know, sexualizing me, why shouldn't I be entitled to that money that I can conduct from that? And when you said the mental thing, it really resonated with me in terms of everything here is external. It changes, it sags, you can stick things on, you can take it off. But in here, this is the most precious thing to me because no one, well, they can try and take it away from you, but this will never really like be someone else's, you know.
Mm,
It will always be your own.
yeah, exactly that. And when I think about, you know, I think when you take away the money aspect of it, how many people may not have engaged in sex work, but they've slept with someone to get somewhere, or
Yes.
they've you know said to their partner, even though they didn't want to have sex with them, they've had sex anyway because it's just easier, you know?
Mm.
Or, how many of us, if we don't get money involved, have used sex to navigate something we want or something we need, um, or as an exchange of services that don't include money but may include housing, may include food, may include, anything else.
Resource.
Yeah, resources. Um, and, is not marriage basically the same sort of contract in a way? But none of us are planning on banning that institution. Um,
No, we all quite like a nice wedding and to put our Sunday
we
hats
quite
on.
like that, and um, sorry, I keep referring to things I say with students, but it's really interesting some of the questions they bring up when they're interested in violence or they're interested in exploitation. And I have to remind them that in the Netherlands, that more women are killed in marriages by their intimate partners than sex workers are killed by clients.
Yeah.
So, but we're not looking on banning the institution of marriage, even though it's evidently way more dangerous than engaging in sex work. So it's really interesting that, we have these different scenarios where, you know, in particular, because it's what the government and what the industry, what these organizations like to focus on, where women are navigating their lives and certain decisions and certain dangers are seen as more okay than other dangers, even if they are more violent, even if they are more potentially dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's something I think we need to have a greater discussion about, because I don't think many people like to admit that yeah, okay, I've had sex to navigate a situation, or I've had
Yeah.
sex to get myself out of a situation or to make something easier for myself.
Mm.
And that in turn is really no different to sex work other than the money aspect to it.
Yeah.
I think what a lot of feminists are forgetting is any restriction that you put on sex workers, sex workers are almost canaries in the tunnel in a way, and that anything that restricts sex workers and sexuality is eventually going to backfire on you as a woman.
Yeah.
Um, because yeah, how do you know that you're not going to get stopped by the police because you look like you're wearing the clothes that a sex worker would wear? How
I
do you
worked
know?
at,
Go on.
sorry to interrupt, but I worked at a bar in East London and I was just on the bar. That's what I did. And I went home at 12 o'clock at night. I put a big coat on because I just didn't feel comfortable walking home in a denim skirt and a tube top. Kill me, you know. A a police van pulled over and tried to get me into the car because they thought I was curb crawling.
It's sorry, it's not funny, but it's just it's so easy for that to then be the excuse to control women. And oh well, we've created this law because we want to protect sex workers, and then you get lumped into that example of being sex workers, and really it's a case of you were wearing something that police officer didn't think that a quote unquote normal woman would wear. You were out past the time that a normal woman would be out, and you were doing something that a normal woman wouldn't do, which is walking by themselves, and that then becomes the standards. No, sorry, it makes me so angry. But if that is what sex workers are going through, that is what all women are going through. So it's a case of, if you want to improve, if you're really a feminist and you really want to improve the positioning of sex workers, then create laws that don't criminalize us, and aim towards reducing austerity measures. If you really want sex workers to leave sex work, or you want them to have the opportunity to leave sex work, then stop making us so fucking poor. Stop creating situations where, mothers of children are having to get involved in sex work
Yeah.
because the country's cut their benefits.
Why I got into stripping is because I saw I could make X amount of money, invest it into what I actually want to do. And from that, I always believe if you don't truly enjoy the job in terms of like, you know, you're just there for the monetary value, I think personally you should always have an exit plan or something you want to do beyond that, you know, and you'll get some sex workers who will die on the hill saying, you know, like, I can stay in this and do it forever. I think in any job you should have progression and move anywhere. Um, but I just want to like bounce over to like, you know, sex workers and relationships and maintaining relationships. Isn't it true that most sex workers more are in a relationship than not in a relationship?
I'm not sure of the actual statistics, particularly in the Netherlands, but I know lots of sex workers that are in relationships. I'm in a relationship myself.
Exact
Um,
same thing with who I know,
yeah,
you know.
and it's I yeah, I think this are, and it's definitely a question that comes up a lot in our walk and talks and in our lectures. Is, you know, how do people maintain relationships? Um, and, you know, I've known people who are married and work in the windows. I know people who have married clients that they've met in the windows. It's not a great business model. I don't suggest it for everyone, to go and marry all your clients. But yeah, I don't think sex workers, if anything, that I found from doing sex work myself is that it taught me way better boundaries in my
Yes.
relationships. I became aware of the cost of my emotional and sexual labor, and that
Yes.
should not be something that comes for free. Um, and it gave me way more understanding of what I like during sex, and it gave me way more understanding of how to say no to things, and it being a case of this is my hard no. Um, and yeah, I'm not saying that's the same experience for everyone in sex work, because I know some people are very like, I do this job, I get out, and then I don't think about it. But it gave me so much to ponder on and so much to explore and to think, oh, actually, I kind of enjoyed what I was asked to do there. Like, is that something I could integrate into my sex life outside? Um, so that I think a lot of people have this idea that if you're the partner of a sex worker, that you're either, you know, cockholded or you're a pimp. You know, it's one or the other. Either you're walked
Yeah.
over or you're exploiting it in some way. Um, and I think that's because people ultimately see sex workers as unlovable, and that's so sad to me that you can be seen in that way.
They're probably, if you look at just based off my friendship group and
Mm.
what I've seen, they're probably actually some of the most loyalist partners you'll find out there,
Oh,
I think,
definitely,
in my
definitely.
opinion.
I think
Yeah.
if you're mature enough and secure enough to date someone who is involved in the sex industry and not be fazed by that, or be able to have open and frank conversations about it, then you are the best people. Um, you know, if you can see that what you have with someone is way beyond the sexual services that they are providing for someone else, and understand that clear boundary, then yeah, you are like kind of upper echelon human. That shouldn't be the case. It should, you know, you shouldn't be giving a people cookie for that. But I think that in a society that pushes this idea that you're less of a man, or you are inherently exploitant, um, because you have a partner who's a sex worker, and you go against that ideology and say, no, I love this person and I trust in them and I'm letting them do their own thing, yeah, have free cookies. It's
It's true, it's true. The rise of this red pill community, tatism, whatever you want to call it, like
mm,
ultra hyper masculine big dick energy, whatever they
mm,
want to identify as. Basically, if you look at Andrew Tate, and the reason why I speak about him, because it matters, young boys are consuming this.
mm,
Because whilst women have accelerated in academia and basically in the workplace, men have stagnated. They've not moved with. So
mm,
in you put Andrew Tate, and he kind of takes that cluster that have not moved along with women. But basically, if you look at what he's trying to do, I don't believe that man is religious at all. I think he finds the best way to affiliate with a religion that fits with his brand. And at the moment, I feel quite bad for the Muslim community because he's taking one element of the Muslim community and affiliating it into his personal brand. And that's having multiple wives. And, you know, that's just basically, what's the term for it? Non-monogamy or
Yeah, non-monogamy or polygamy.
polyamory?
Polygamy, I think, is the marriage of.
Okay.
Let me quickly Google this, but I think it's polyamory, is multiple relationships, but then polygamy, or bigamy, I think it might be. We'll figure it out.
Again, if no one's hurting, then that's fine. But he's
Yeah.
using it as a way to sling mud and throw shit at women who have ownership within the sexual industry, or people who define their own relationships outside of that sacred religious bond of this word we're trying to find out of what it's called. Now, I just think that's so. It sounds very snowflake, but it's just so toxic. Like, people can't see through it.
No, I think what Andrew Tate has, credit to him, quite successfully
The
tapped
marketeer.
into. Yeah, it is to a group of people who feel extremely disenfranchised. Life has not turned out the way that they were promised it was going to be. And instead of realizing that the dream they have been sold is one of patriarchy, which harms both women and men equally, harms all of us, is to blame rather than women beginning to be successful or become educated or have more autonomy and independence. That becomes an easier scapegoat than the rules and social regulations of patriarchy that have been in place that have ultimately benefited some of men. Obviously, within there's a prioritization within that system of richer white cis men being prioritized over poorer racialized men. And because life has not turned out the way that some of them were promised, that some of them felt was guaranteed,
They didn't get their moment in the sun.
they didn't get their moment in the sun. And it's a case of, well, someone needs to be blamed for that. And, fear and anxiety very easily become anger. And I think then, Andrew sweeps up with that, like most fanatical groups do, like most fanatical leaders do, and says, hey, I can provide you a solution. I can provide you the key here. The problem is not with you, it's with everyone else. And I think that is what he is tapped into, while still proliferating himself as a better man than every other man, which I think is hilarious because have you seen him? But it's also, yeah, it is the workings of a narcissist. It is and I know we throw around that word a lot in society nowadays, but this is someone who genuinely thinks that he is better than other people and that he's smarter than other people and that he's more of a businessman than other people.
The man can't acknowledge that women have value when he stands on the shoulders of women, having built a business around women,
Yeah.
webcamming.
Yeah.
Without those women, what are you?
Yeah.
A shitty kickboxer.
Yeah. Exactly. It's yeah, we could talk about Andrew Tate till the sun goes down, and I could
It's what he'd want.
Exactly. So let's not give him more airtime.
Actually, I had a guy in the strip club come in and he subscribed to his service and then he unsubscribed. And he
Okay,
told
so
me,
he was a reformant.
yeah. And he was actually really a sweet boy and he's like 23 now.
Yeah.
And I think he was along for the ride in the early days. And we know the system's like a pyramid scheme. There's a paywall, they pay, and they get access to this information.
And like levels, right?
But basically, what happens is you're not accessing information. Actually, all you're doing is, in order to stay into this Discord or this group, when you pay a fee, you can actually make money by creating content, positive content around Andrew Tate, which helps like obliterate any negative things that are said in the press. And that's why through the algorithm, it's so repeated in young boys. And even my feed, I searched his name once and all the time.
Yeah,
I
it
just see
comes
this
up now.
propaganda.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize that's how the business model works.
Yeah. No, it's very, hand it to him, it's clever. But it's also a business model that, he's not special by using it. Other people have used it. It is, like you say, perfect pyramid scheme in a way. But yeah, I like to think he will go to jail. I really would like him to go to jail, but then there's lots of things like this have happened. And I never like to get my hopes up too much for these things, because there's always a mistrial. There's always something which comes out of the woodwork last minute and makes you go, ah, shit.
I think he'll go to jail not because of the crime, but because they want to make an example.
I hope so. I really hope so. You should do like a podcast commentary of the trial or something.
I should, but also because I'm quite new into this venture, I'm really scared of people shouting at me saying I'm part of the problem or I'm this or I'm that. Because
yeah, at the end of the day, the world is going to look at it no matter what you do. So I think that we can't not be part of the problem. It's more of a case of within that problem, what voices are getting put forward. So if you decide to step back and not take part in it, that is absolutely your choice and completely valid. But then if the only people who are commenting on it are the far right or these kind of incels, then what happens then?
It's a really good point.
Not to put the pressure on you to be like, you have to be the sex worker savior in this situation, but
I come from a family of men and none of them really would support his message. So no. I think you are right. I probably should do something on it, and I will do something on it.
Yeah.
But I just hate that man. He probably is. I said this to the Dom. He's the type of man who hyper masculine, but probably loves a fucking strap on.
Of course. And they always are. They always are. It's it's always the ones who want to look big and skinny, or not to small dick shame, but
tiny.
Yeah, exactly.
I just hope with this generation, let's call them zillennials, millennial and Gen Z, we get better at understanding nuance, information, and being able to have a debate and maybe listen to something we don't agree with. Like that's what this podcast is for, to have a nuanced conversation about the sexual economy. And part of your work, I guess, is engaging in that grey area and kind of finding out what is black, what is white, and having that nuanced conversation. And it just lacks in society.
Yeah, I think while we are definitely becoming a more vocal and information sharing generation, what I've noticed in the Netherlands is that we definitely have a growing younger conservative and younger Christian movement growing. And the same with all of Europe. We see this kind of neo-Nazi or neo-right growth in Europe. And I think the thing with our work, and I think with any kind of marginality that you talk about, is it's never a case of, you have a tick box and you tick it off and it's like, right, that issue's dealt with. Never, we don't have to discuss it anymore. I think the same as with racism and with sexism and with transphobia and homophobia is that as soon as you turn your head away from it and you stop talking about it, it's like a dragon that rears its head again. And you have to prevent the wave from becoming so big that no matter what you talk about, you can't stop it. So it's the same with sex work. I think a lot of people look at the Netherlands and they think, oh, well, it's legalized. Like, there's nothing else we need to talk about. But actually what we're beginning to see in the Netherlands is a rising tide of conservatism. And
because it swings both ways when it goes
it's a pendulum, exactly. And that's exactly how a sex worker activist of 30 years told me about it the other day, of that, she's been engaged with activism since the 80s. And the reason she stopped is because she says, while things have changed, we're exactly back in the position we were, back in the 1980s. So, and that was really harrowing for me to hear, because then it's like, okay, well, you did so much during that time and you felt the same as you did in the 80s as you do in 2023. So that's why we have to constantly keep doing what we're doing, and why we'll keep doing what we're doing and talking about this.
But we have more spaces to speak about things that are taboo now.
Exactly, we do. But with that, we also have, the opposite side. And I don't like to talk about it like, oh, it's us against them. But, in some ways it is. And, while we have more open spaces to talk about things, so do the likes of Andrew Tate and people like that. So we just have to keep battling with words. We have to keep talking about it and keep having a presence.
And as well, like, just stop being stupid of letting a 1% from each side ruin the actual core side of a conservative or a liberal, because, there is stupidity on both sides, I think, where, it's just so beyond rampant. For example, I'm liberal. I believe that a woman should have a right to an abortion, absolutely 100%. But I also can have compassion for people who are not in line with that, and I can see why they find that a problem. But I don't go running around and smacking them over the head and stuff and kicking them. And, I think sometimes that side as well, they have no compassion for people who choose to have an abortion whilst they stand out and hold a picture of a dead fetus outside of a clinic. I think it's disgusting on both ends, but you get it in every vicinity.
Yeah. I think so. And I also think, like, I myself am I consider myself quite anarchist, quite radical in terms of thought. Not so much in actual practicality anymore, because I try and keep my criminal record as clean as possible. But it's, especially when I was younger, I was very much about, like, to step up. We have to fight out. We have to, we have to protest. And I still believe in that. And I do believe that there is still space for revolutionary action, and that there is still space for protest. And one of the things I learned in anthropology is that rioting is the answer for those that aren't allowed to speak within political spaces. In that, when we think about women's vote in the UK, there was 100 years of following the political process, of doing things by the book, doing things by the T, and nothing happened. It was only when we started blowing up letterboxes and threatening to blow up churches that stuff actually happened. And I also believe that you can't have riots all the time. I don't believe that you can build a political movement on riots. I truly believe that there has to be kind of midpoint between the two, and that you have to have political interaction, but also know that if the political interaction doesn't work, that will resort to violent and destructive methods to get what is needed out of society.
Tyranny.
Yeah, tyranny, but also, the fact that when we look at any movement that has happened, any social movement that has happened throughout history, if we look at women's rights, if we look at Stonewall, if we look at Malcolm X, if we look at Black Lives Matter and stuff like that, rioting and, unruly politics, in a way, is essential to these movements. And along with all the other stuff that was going on in terms of policy and legislation, and God love those people who do that work and are willing to go by the book for years, decades, whatever it takes. It took someone to throw a brick at the police officers at Stonewall. That was the catalyst, that was the change.
If I was to compare it to something, I would compare it to like, I often simplify things because I'm dyslexic with my own brain, but I'd simplify it as sending a warning shot to the bully.
Yeah. Exactly. I think it is exactly that. I think often those who are marginalized and those who are prevented from having rights are assumed to be harmless, are assumed to be passive, are assumed to, they will just put up with this, and what are they going to do? And I think sometimes you have to, it's, like in any situation, sometimes you've got to throw that shot, or you've got to shout out, or you've got to throw that punch to let someone know, like, I am not yours to be bullied. I remember as a kid, as someone who was hideously bullied, it took for me one day to stand up to the bully and behave violently. I'm not proud of it, but
Mm.
it took that moment for people to realize, oh, okay, Phoebe is not to be fucked with, for the rest of my schooling to go on and to never be bullied again.
I'm sure there's a biological way to describe it, but it's like animals trying to assert dominance
Yeah,
of what benefits them most. I'm glad you stood up for yourself.
yeah. Well, it's not my nature at all. I'm a very passive and loving person, and if I could stick away from violence as much as possible, then I would prefer that. But when someone imposes um, violence on you or tries to make your life miserable, creates a situation where your life becomes unbearable, then I don't expect people to always turn the other cheek for that. I believe sometimes you need to headbutt back. So it's the same with sex workers, you know. It's the same as in the situation in the red light district. You know, we've tried to put pen to paper. We've tried to, um, you know, go about things the way that the municipality would like us to go about it. But at the end, it led to the protests in April where, you know, sex workers in the window said, enough's enough. Like, we're tired of being called you're vulnerable women. We're tired of being told that we're the puppets of window operators, that we're passive, that we're not well educated, that we don't speak English, that we're, you know, trafficking victims, when we've tried to tell you 1,000 times in letters that that's not the case. We're going to roam the streets. Think that it's something for politicians to always be wary of that, you know, these cloaks and dagger processes that happen um, will not prevent people from getting what they want in the end, or what they need. And I think that's the key thing.
I mean, it's very hard to have compassion on one side, which you have to understand someone's problem, and then having that anarchist direct approach of like, let's burn the house
Mm,
down and start again because clearly this is fucked up,
yes.
you know. But we are getting towards the end of our 2 hour session. So I think when I'm speaking to people who, you know, are theorists and experts in their field, I try and get a little nugget knowledge of what we can do to improve things. And I guess what I'm going to ask you is, how can we get rid of stigmatization around sex work? And the second question is, how are we going to get better, or what can we do in our own lives to work towards decriminalisation of the sex industry?
Yeah, so I think the second question kind of is the answer for my first question, is that the first stage to destigmatization in my mind is decriminalization. I think when we had the, you know, when gay marriage and, you know, gay relationships were decriminalized, this became the catalyst for better education around homosexuality and queerness, um, and in terms of services that were able to be offered, in terms of communities that were able to be built, in terms of people actually being able to go to the police and say, look, I've been discriminated against on this basis. That is the starting point. It's not the end. It's, like I said, it's not the tick box that we need and that we can kind of tap our hands and go, right, okay, we're never going to be stigmatized again. It is the beginning. Because at the moment, sex workers are not on an even playing field. And it's about, what we need at the moment is not equality, we need equity. We need for our our part of the mountain to be level with every other worker in the world and to be seen as equal labour workers. It's not to say that sex work is the same as other work, because, like, being prime minister of the country is not the same as other work. There are different conditions, but to be given the same standard that all workers are given as a basis is really important. I also think with that needs to become the categorization of sex work as a discriminatory category. So At the moment in the Netherlands, you can be denied bank accounts, you can be denied loans, you can be denied, mortgages, you can be denied jobs, you can be denied financial and social opportunities because you are a sex worker, even though it is a legal profession. But you cannot go to the police and say, I have been discriminated against on the basis of being a sex worker. So I think that is also something we need. So we need decriminalisation, and we need categorisation of sex work as a discriminatory category. And then in terms of how do we reach that decriminalisation, I think as difficult as it is, we need more sex workers to speak out. We need to hear more testimony from sex workers that goes against the narrative that the media and that anti-trafficking, anti-prostitution networks are setting out in the world, that, you are either a criminal or you are a victim. And by sharing our diverse opinions and by claiming space in the public world, we can change opinions about that. And I think when people realize that sex workers are not a minute category, but actually all of us know a sex worker or someone who has been a sex worker, you realize how
your grandma might have been one and you never know about it.
Well, exactly. You begin to realize how much public and political power we have as a group. And I think it's also about, creating better communities as well, realizing the resources within your sex worker communities, who's a good writer, who's a good speaker, who has access to this information, and use your clients. If you've got political clients, that you can get to do what you want and do that. And I think just better education. I think there needs to be so much more education about what sex work is and what it really looks like for those who engage in it.
Yep. I mean, what you said is really insightful. Even if you're not exactly on the same page as us, I hope you can listen to something and, as we said, maybe have compassion or learn something that you didn't know before from this conversation. You sound so knowledgeable in what you're doing. I mean, is there something you're wanting to do your PhD next, or?
Yeah, I think I would like to keep working for at least another year. And then I need to formulate a question, which is always the most difficult bit of academic work, because I want to investigate everything, but I think that's the ADHD part of my brain that wants to do that. But yeah, I think I'll probably do my PhD in the Netherlands, but I tend to go with the wind, so we'll see where we end up, and yeah, maybe we'll have another talk in a year and something might have changed.
No, maybe I can get you in person.
Yeah, that would be great. I'd love that.
Well, I used to live there, so I'm always going back and forth.
Yeah, me too, to see family, so I have to come through London anyway, so we'll definitely have to meet up.
Well, thank you so much for, your time and what you have to say. If you do want to follow any links that Phoebe is associated with the PIC, we're going to leave them in the bio below. Do you want to shout out anything or any links?
Yeah, so at the moment we unfortunately have had our Instagram blocked. So yeah, I think our Twitter is probably the most active, so that's just at PIC Amsterdam. And yeah, the other links we'll leave with you on here. And yeah, just pop into us. We're open Wednesday through to Saturday from 12 o'clock through to 5 o'clock. And yeah, we welcome anyone in the door. So please come along.
Any questions anyone has, or you're just a bit curious, it's always a centre open for you to go into. And big up to Elon Musk for not censoring you guys on Twitter.
Yes, thank God. Who would have thought I'd be thanking Elon Musk?
Our protector.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much, and I hope you have a lovely day, and thank you for joining us on this episode of Sexonomic.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been lovely speaking to you.
Thank you. If you want to follow any of the social links of Sexonomic, they're in the link
and bio section below. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.